thank you everyone that is still busy joining, and for those that are already here. My name is Vikas Kruger. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. I direct the Power Futures Lab, which is a research unit at the University of Cape Town's Business School. We focus on investment, regulation and reform in Africa's power sector. Today's webinar is really about understanding what is going on with South Africa's renewable energy procurement program. It has long been noted as one of the most successful programs in the world in terms of tendering for renewable energy projects. We've actually just published a paper with researchers in Europe where we compared the South African program to European programs, and the South African renewable energy IPP procurement program scores above the European programs on every metric. Pricing, realization rates, broader impacts. It's a really success story for the country. But I think what we are all experiencing at the moment as well is deepening load shedding. South Africa is in the midst of a energy crisis, and it is increasing by the day. Eskom and government has made it clear that the solution to this is largely getting new capacity onto the grid, and this capacity will need to come from the private sector. And the quickest way of getting new capacity on the grid, and probably the cheapest, is to build out renewables. Now, the REI PPP program is one of the kind of flagship programs that are supposed to be achieving this, but I think we're struggling to see those results being realized in these latest procurement rounds. And so today is an attempt to understand what is going on and what can be done, what will be done differently. For that, I'm very thankful to have a really good panel with us today to help us unpack this. I will be introducing them as they sign up, but just very quickly, we have Mr. Bernard Magoro here, who's the head of the IPP office. We have Rogan Bailey, who heads up business development at EDF Renewables. We have Mfundi Songo, who heads up the grid access unit at Eskom. We have Alistair Campbell, who's the managing director of Vantage Green X, who's a lender into the renewables program, as well as Daniel Zinman from Rand Merchant Bank as well, heading up their power and infrastructure investment division. And so with this panel, we're going to be unpacking these issues. Again, as Pamela said, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. I will be trying to prioritize questions from journalists. So just be aware of that. We're going to try to get to all the questions, but there will be a kind of a ranking happening. Yeah, and otherwise, thank you for being here. Bernard, are you here?
I am here, Vikas. Good morning, and good morning to those who joined us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. I think you are the man of the moment. I think most people are here to hear what you are saying, and we're thankful for your time. Bernard, I think the big burning question that everyone is wondering about is, we've had the risk mitigation program, we've had bid window 5, but we've actually only had, I think, 4 projects reach financial close, or at least signing their PPAs. What is going on? Why are projects taking so long? And those that have been able to reach financial close, how did they do that?
Thank you, Vikas. And as I said, good morning again to those who joined us. I understand we've got people from all over the world. Yes, the program is well and alive. Maybe I must start by acknowledging that, yes, we do have an energy crisis in South Africa, and we are all affected. In fact, before joining this panel, I had to check the load shedding schedule to make sure that there won't be any disruption during the panel discussions. So that's something that we are all concerned about, and we're doing everything within our powers as government to roll out the procurement process as fast as possible. So what is happening in the IPP office space? We ran the two programs that you highlighted, risk mitigation and followed by bid window 5. Yes, we had some challenges along the way, and I think if I can start with risk mitigation, we had, firstly, we were challenged by one of the unsuccessful bidders, and that unfortunately did result in some delays. And as a result of those delays, we had some bidders now struggling to close. So that's a reality that we are facing. So we are busy engaging bidders to see how best we can reach conclusion on that program. And then bid window 5, as you mentioned, we had delays as well. But the reasons there, we have always communicated. Bid window 5 was delayed by the budget quotations issuing process. There has been a challenge, and ESCOM has admitted, I'm glad Fundi is here. There's been a challenge in the executions of BQs on time. And I think you will recall that end of April, we're expecting to sign all the 25 preferred bidders. And unfortunately, none of them had a BQ at that stage. I'm happy to report that by end of, where are we now? End of August, we had 24 out of 25 with their BQs having been issued. And as a result of that, we were able to sign the first 3 projects. So in total, we've got 6 projects signed, not 4 Vickers. So it's 3 from risk mitigation and then the other 3 from bid window 5. The one that has not received their BQ is because they are dependent on one of the risk mitigation projects. And I think that will also become clearer soon once we close the 2 projects, 2 programs as well. So way forward, we are trying to close these 2 programs. We've set a date of end of October to sign the agreements with both, with all preferred bidders for both programs. And that process is currently underway. We are engaging them. In fact, as we speak, there are meetings with both sets of preferred bidders today to finalize the process to sign before the end of this month.
Thank you, Bernard. So just to clarify, so this October deadline, I mean, it's one of several kind of postponements to the deadline. Is this the final time that it will be moved out? And if projects do not reach their agreed time deadlines, what will happen?
Yes, we've communicated last week that this is the final deadline, unless obviously there is capacity issue. I must say that there are many players in this process, ourselves, ESCOM, preferred bidders, and the lenders. So unless if there is a delay because of the volume, I mean, we've got 22 projects from bid window 5 and 9 projects from risk mitigation. So as we start with the consultation and finalization of the project's agreement, it may be that we are not able to execute all, as I said, 31 projects in 1 month, but that's something that we can manage. But in terms of finalizing the process, end of October is the deadline.
Okay. Sorry, that I just want to follow up on something that you mentioned just now. The issue of capacity. Is there a sufficient capacity within the IPP office and your advisors to deal with the volume that's needed now? And I think especially also going forward, if we look at the projections of what is going to be procured, do you have sufficient capacity now, or do you need more?
We do have capacity, but obviously, like any other entity, capacity is always relative. So if you have 31 projects you have to close in 1 month, it does become a challenge. But if we spread our programs accordingly, we should have enough capacity to manage. But I must also state here that we utilize a lot of transaction advisors. The IPP office oversees the process, but a lot of work is done by transaction advisors who, I mean, in this space, there's quite a number of companies that are able to assist in that aspect. So in that respect, so we are working with external support from transaction advisors, and I can confirm that we do have enough capacity.
Okay, thank you so much. Then just a final question. I mean, if projects were unable to reach the October deadline, and it is clearly not an IPP office or government issue, but it's just frankly the project that is not able to make its economics work. What will happen with those projects? Will the bid bonds be called, and what will happen with the unallocated volume that's then left over from bin window 5 and risk mitigation?
Yeah, so because the RFP is very clear in terms of the process, you know, for concluding the procurement process. So, for example, what you mentioned, you know, if there is a default by the preferred bidders, they have signed an undertaking with a lot of obligations. Similarly, we also have a role to play as well. So we have that process clearly spelled out in the RFP in terms of what next, you know, if a project is not able to close. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, because our expectation is for all the projects to close as per the appointment letters. And then the other comment you mentioned is around the capacity that might not be closed. So our view is that, you know, there are a lot of programs that are coming. So if we are not able to close all the projects that have been allocated, whether it's risk mitigation or bid window 5, what is key for us is to, you know, as quickly as possible, you know, roll out another program, get that capacity to be contracted as soon as possible. So we will definitely use that capacity in future procurement bid windows.
Okay, thank you. I mean, last follow-up, and then I will give you a reprieve. Just on the timelines, I think you mentioned now, so between those 6, those timelines have been clearly communicated. There was also battery storage and gas, I think, that had been mentioned before as being planned for this year. Could you just confirm those dates as it is scheduled with you at the moment?
Yes, so let me start with battery storage. Battery storage, we are planning to release today. We're busy looking at all the final ticks and I's and boxes, and to tick the boxes and crosses and put the I's on the, you know, the dots on the I's. So that we are still hoping to release before the end of the day. That's on the battery storage. And then, which one did you mention? The gas. Yeah. Our timeline is to release the gas RFP before the end of the financial year. So March 2023, we're planning to release that program. Okay. But as I said before, the gas, it's quite a challenging space in South Africa, because it's you know, it involves multiple players. The ports infrastructure, you know, requires attention. We don't have enough capacity to import the gas that's required for this project. So therefore, we have to include all the stakeholders that are involved in the process of procuring gas. You know, Transnet has a role, TNPA has a role, Department of Transport has a role. So it is a complex program, which you know, we are trying our best to meet the March deadline, but obviously it all depends on all the stakeholders, you know, reaching conclusions on some of the dependencies.
And just to confirm, the IPP office is coordinating all these different stakeholders for that process, for the gas specifically?
Yeah, for the program that we're running, we are coordinating all the stakeholders' involvement in this process. But obviously there are specific activities that, you know, let's say Transnet or the Ports Authority will have to undertake on their side. So our role is to make sure that there is alignment with our program, because you don't want to end up with a power plant but no molecules to run the turbine. So that coordination is key for us, and that's what we're managing.
Okay, thank you. That's a massive task. Thank you, Bernard. Let me now go to Rogan. Rogan, you represent one of the companies, the first company from Bitwindow 5 that has been able to sign its projects agreement, EDF Renewables. It's I think, as if I'm correct, I think you own 40% in the projects that you've developed, and it's a really interesting story. So, how have you been able to reach this important deadline when the rest of the preferred bidders seem to be struggling?
Yeah, good morning, Vickers, morning, Bernard, and hello to everyone on the line. I'm very pleased to participate in this discussion, which is, I think, very front of mind as we're all living through the current situation. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Vickers. Just to confirm, we haven't yet reached financial close yet. As you pointed out, the milestone that we achieved last week, Thursday the 22nd, was to sign the project agreements for the 3 wind farms. So that's the power purchase agreement, the IA, which details all of the economic development obligations that the projects undertake during the construction and the operations period, and then the direct agreements which concern the lenders. So we now have 60 days to achieve the target of commercial and financial close, which we are quite confident we'll achieve. And this is new to the REAP process, where previously you sign the agreements, commercial close and financial close happens concurrently. The process now reflects that of the risk mitigation program, where you have a separate legal closing and a commercial closing period. So I think before I provide some detail on how EDF and we achieved signing and the legal close and intend to reach commercial closing in that timeline, I think it's important to appreciate that the major factors that have made it so challenging are global issues, right? So unlike the past few decades where we've seen renewable energy components and prices steadily decline, for the first time, I think, and quite surprising, we saw cost increases this year and starting last year. These are mainly due to the micro and macroeconomic factors that we are all very well aware of, and they've contributed to significant supply chain disruptions. So we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have the Suez Canal debacle, and most recently the war in Ukraine. All these factors have really impacted the supply chain of the products in the renewable energy industry. And this is, as I said, for the first time in a number of years, in fact, decades, where we've seen an increase in price as opposed to the steady decline. Lastly, I think it's important to note we're entering into a global inflationary cycle. Those of you that have home loans, I think in the last couple of weeks, will know that all too well. And then to answer your question around how we were able to achieve these timelines, so I think a number of factors contributed to it. Firstly, in the signing ceremony last week, our CEO mentioned prudency at bid stage in August 2021. By taking reasonable and conservative assumptions at that stage, we were in a better position to absorb the increases and the challenges that we faced in this last year. I think our wind farms themselves are really well located and very well developed. So they benefit from extremely good wind resource. So coupled with our highly skilled tech and engineering teams, we were able to continually optimize through design enhancements to cope with some of the increases. And I think lastly, the relationships we have with the key stakeholders are paramount. So not just the contractors themselves, who together we have to try and resolve a lot of the cost increases, which impact then the ability to achieve the tariff that the IPPs bid and are ultimately selected and awarded preferred bidder status on. So it's contractors, it's it's relationships with the lenders, it's the advisors, the good rapport we have with the IPP office and the department. Yeah, so I think relationships are also quite key.
Thanks, Rogan. And I mean, on that point, the relationship with the IPP office, I think, as you said, is really key. Have you found that the IPP office has been responsive enough and efficient enough in working with preferred bidders to reach the financial close or the commercial close deadlines? And there's, for example, been, have there been massive changes to the legal documents or some of these other requirements after bid award? And how have you navigated those?
Yeah, so I can't speak for the other preferred bidders and the other IPPs. We personally found the IPP office very responsive. They availed themselves and their advisors to ourselves in the past a couple of months in order to discuss and address the critical points. There were obviously, it's a very fluid market with Eskom undergoing, I think, some significant structural changes. I think it's important to also note that the IPP office plays an intermediary role where they're trying to manage as best and coordinate the agreements that are made and entered into between the seller and the buyer. And where traditionally the buyer has been, you know, the single buyer model, very vertically integrated monolith that is Eskom. I think there are a number of changes that Eskom are undergoing. So you can appreciate the challenge that the IPP office had there. We also found the Eskom's grid access unit very accessible. We were able to conclude on the various CELs, BQs, and ultimately the self-build agreements on time. So as far as Eskom's availability is concerned, that was in order, and it certainly assisted us in achieving legal close on time. Maybe a point, and you mentioned it earlier in your question to Bernard, around the general resources in the market. I think globally, but especially in South Africa, we're seeing a resource vacuum, given the market activity, both from push and pull factors. So everyone's wanting to alleviate themselves from load shedding, but they're also, you know, there's a lot of talent or there's a lot of resourcing happening in the market to deliver on these utility scale projects. So I think just generally in the market, there's a significant resource vacuum. And considering the fact that the IPP office is coordinating not just a single bid window that I get the benefit of focusing on, you know, they're facilitating multiple programs, different technologies, different stakeholders, and they're having to facilitate that across the private and the public sector. So, you know, maybe in a concluding remark is that yes, to answer your question quite frankly, they were available and they were very responsive and receptive to queries and questions that we pose, especially leading up to the critical date of last week, Thursday, the 22nd. Okay,
excellent. Thank you, Rogan. I hope the students that are listening took note of where the job demand is in the market and make sure that you are positioning yourself properly to take part. Rogan, just before I go to Mfundi, just a clarifying question. So you said earlier that last week was legal close, but that's now been separated from commercial and financial close. Why has that been done? What is your understanding of the motivation for separating these two processes?
Yeah, I think you can do it either way. It worked fine in the past, but you know, I think there are two distinct objectives, right? Commercial close. So from a seller's perspective, you know, financial close is very relevant. We're trying to satisfy all the lenders, to then be able to draw down on the facilities and be able to make the payments to the contractors. The legal agreements are obviously very important to us, but the financial close is somewhat distinct from the IPP office. Commercial close is where the tariff gets adjusted and locked in for foreign exchange and inflation changes since the time of bid. So that really is the purpose of commercial close, to update the tariff, lock it in, and confirm all the schedules that are appended to the various legal agreements. The legal agreements themselves, I think, are very standalone and quite an important topic to focus on in isolation. You know, you need to really understand the PPA itself as it relates to your project, as it relates then also to the legacy of the PPA and where it's been applied, how it's been applied, what clauses may change in the PPA as it may affect the risk allocation between the buyer and the seller. So really, I think the focus on having legal close first is really to focus all stakeholders and their advisors on agreeing to this contract that will set the terms for the relationship for the next 20 years. So I think it was, to me, that's my interpretation of the reasoning, really to focus in on concluding the key document that then sets the scene for the relationship and that the banks can lend against. Because if you don't have a PPA that's an agreed form and that's bankable, acceptable to all the lenders and also the sponsors, then you can't fund the project and you don't achieve viability.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope to come back to you a bit later, but thank you, Rogan. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Now switching to Mfundi Songo from Eskom. Mfundi, you have been praised now by Rogan, but Bernard's also pointed out that there have been issues with the budget quotes, and I think the key question I have is, what are the key constraints that the grid access unit is facing, and how are you addressing these?
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon in other parts of the world. First of all, the grid access unit challenges that we have been facing initially were the timelines, meeting them for the CELs. And then secondly, it was the budget quotations, and it is still like that. As Rogan has said, on the CELs, over the past 6 to 12 months, we have checked a number of our internal processes and aligned them and streamlined them and cut off a number of things that were delaying the issuing of the CELs, because we saw that the CELs are more of an exploration, which is good for the industry and for the businesses to understand where they are. And in so doing, we have reduced the timelines from an almost 90 days to closer to 2 months or less, depending on the complexity of the scope. In terms of the budget quotations, the biggest challenges that we've been facing is that the design reviews from the IPPs, once they go out, they take a little bit of time before they come back for a review to ensure that what we get is okay. And then in terms of the acceptance of the budget quotations again, for example, on the RMIPP and the bid window 5 that Mr. Magoros just spoke about, we had quite a significant time before an acceptance of the budget quotations, which leaves very little time for Eskom to start preparing the budget quotation, because up until the budget quotation has been accepted and it's been paid, there is no committal in terms of whether work will go ahead. And then the third thing is that there is grid capacity challenges. So as I'm sitting right now, someone is applying and someone is taking up that capacity. The moment there is a delay in terms of an acceptance of a CEL, or a customer estimate letter quotation. If someone pays in, it's a first comes, first served. They take up that capacity. Now, the budget court will now have to go through the process where one has to analyze the power system and ensure that does it still have the capacity that was there in the initial phase when we had the cost estimate later. Now, in the analysis of working with the IPPs, as Rogan has just said, there is another vacuum that we have picked up, especially from the power systems analysis skills. We usually get into a stage where the location of the IPP or the expected network is not according to what the power system will behave. So because we are looking at the overall system, it's not an individual customer that comes in. Therefore, there is a need to look at the holistic picture. And IPPs are encouraged to actually have consulting engineers or that have got analytical power system skills, which are seemingly not coming forthright in these phases. And then on the skills side too, there is a need to have the proper designs, and there is that gap too. So those are some of the high level challenges that I would say. And then the other thing that we have done now to ensure that we are fully aligned is to have a proper stakeholder engagement. So we have engaged with the IPP associations, the minerals councils of this world, and other institutions to ensure that the issue of grid capacity is clearly articulated. It is known that capacity is a challenge. Therefore, the competition is stiff, but however, with that being the case, let's work together. So immediately, an IPP thinks of or has identified a place for, say, a large size, say 200 megawatts or 300, whatever. It is imperative that they engage with the senior execs in the respective provinces, customer level they are, to ensure that we don't surprise each other. And that, as Rogan has said, that is where the cooperation has worked very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fundi. I mean, just on that point, is there beyond that initial kind of working with Eskom and making them aware of what is being planned, is there a greater role for the private sector potentially in helping to unlock grid access? I'm specifically referring here to things like having independent transmission lines, but there are other options too. Is any of that currently being considered?
At the moment, Eskom's mandate is to build the transmission system. There is no, I haven't had, or maybe there could be other plans for the development of parallel power system. But however, what is encouraged is that the current transmission development system plans, all projects that are coming online, first of all, they should be aligned. And one thing that should be, in terms of the stakeholder engagements, that should be clearly articulated, is the fact that the current transmission development plans were developed without the current IPP's renewable energies locations as the main driver. It was to ensure that the generation center was in Mpumalanga mostly, or in the Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and Limpopo provinces. But with the current renewables locations, that is changing. And those changes are encouraged in terms of building by the self-build agreements. Therefore, those that come in, the IPPs, they are encouraged to, first of all, for example, if you look at the Northern Cape, substations such as Aggeneys, Kronos, they've expanded beyond their initial design to ensure that the system is stable. Now, those changes are coming with the IPPs as they come. Therefore, the self-built agreements are encouraged to start with what is already there, so that there are no surprises, and that is where the delays are coming in most cases. For example, where already there are corridors that have been identified, it makes it easy.
Okay, thank you, Mfundi. I will hopefully come back to you when we have the questions and answers, but thank you for being here and also for making the time. I know it's a very busy time in the grid access unit. Alistair, Campbell, you've been involved in the renewables program from the start. You've provided, you've lent into these projects, and I'm sure you've seen the trends developing over time. From what we've heard now from Mfundi and Rogan and others, it's been mentioned that there have been important changes in cost drivers, but what are some of the other important trends that you've seen in terms of who the successful bidders are, who the partners are that they have, especially in the BEE space, financing costs, kit costs, and is this sustainable, these trends that we are seeing?
Well, thanks, Vikas, and good day to everybody. Look, the REAP process, or the REAP IPP procurement program, has changed quite a lot since 2012. There have been a lot of developments. What started as a nascent sector is now pretty much a mature one. We've had quite conservative lending terms in the first couple of bid windows, quite high equity returns, slightly lower gearing than we're seeing. And certainly the trend at the moment is towards more highly geared projects, more aggressively structured construction contracts, split contracts, as opposed to full EPC wrap. As I said, the gearing is going up. The tenors being offered by lenders have gone up. Equity returns have come down. The covenants that people are looking for have become more aggressive. As a lender, it's not ideal. You're sitting with a situation where you're actually increasing a whole lot of risks. You're increasing gearing, you're increasing tenor. Loans are sculpted more heavily. The problem that everybody faces, both lenders and equity providers alike, is that if you have a heavily structured loan and quite tight covenants, then the likelihood of there being defaults under these projects is increased. And when you factor in an 18 or 20-year loan on a 20-year contracted revenue stream, all of these factors contribute to riskier projects. And perhaps that's a symptom of a maturing sector. But I think I'm not speculating here, I'm guessing that there will be, well, it's not guessing, I'm sure that there will be one or two projects that will default in the next couple of years because of how tightly structured they are. So everybody knows the score. It's a much more competitive place. I've analyzed all of the successful bidders, and people think there's a diverse universe of bidders in the REAP program. There's just over a dozen bidders that have secured close to just over 80% of the winning bids. So there is a relatively small number of bidders that have been successful and continue to be successful. And what we're seeing also is that there's a consolidation of bids post commissioning, where some of the financial close shareholders have exited and made way for institutional investors to come into those projects. I know that you're going to ask a question about the BE a little later, but certainly from a BE perspective, the concentration risk that we saw in bid window 5 has been addressed in the bid window 6 documentation, and you're not allowed to have a single BE shareholder that sits across multiple bids in round 6, which is good because it results in a diverse spread of BE shareholdings in the process. Kit costs, yeah, I think part of the problems, in addition to the issues that were raised earlier, by Rogan in relation to round 5 closures. The issues there are that some of the bidders speculated on the cost of equipment coming down and didn't fix their EPC prices. And as a result, when the prices went up because of the various logistical challenges and the Ukraine war and COVID, they found themselves in a situation where they weren't able to adjust the tariff to accommodate these increases in costs. And that's been a problem. And in addition to the budget quotes, it's one of the reasons why some of the round 5 deals haven't yet closed. I'll leave some space for Dan to answer questions as well, to give his response as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll get to Dan now, but before I do, South Africa's financial sector has been crucial to this program, right? Most of the funding has been coming from South Africa and specifically from our banks and institutional investors. We now sitting with a situation where we need to have at least 50 gigawatts of new capacity by 2030, 2035. If we look at Eskom's decommissioning schedule, that's a massive ask. That's a lot of new capacity and that's a lot of money. Do you think that South Africa's financial sector is deep enough? Can we mobilize sufficient capital to meet this requirement? And if we can't, where else should we be looking?
Look, I'm the eternal optimist in terms of capital in this country. There's never really been a shortage of capital and appetite on the part of investors into funds like the one I manage, which are institutional investors. And also there's been very little shortage of appetite from banks to participate in the process. And that's evidenced by the very competitive terms that we're seeing in the process right now. The real challenge, I think, going forward in this space is to attract funding to entities like the unbundled Eskom Transmission Company, which is going to need to spend a lot of money to open up capacity. We've got all this fabulous solar resource and wind resource in the Northern Cape. I think in an IPP office presentation recently, there was mention of 57 megawatts of capacity in the Northern Cape and something like 57 gigawatts of interest and only 6 or 7 gigawatts of carrying capacity. So we have all these projects that are ready to bid, but all competing for a very constrained grid capacity. So we need funding. There's been obviously announcements by various European lenders as well as President Biden to provide funding for the just energy transition. And that'll manifest itself in different ways. And hopefully through helping us strengthen the distribution and transmission networks to accommodate all the new power that all the banks and institutional lenders will be providing funding for.
Thank you, Alistair. Let's give Daniel a quick turn, and then I'll return to you as well. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Before I address a specific question to you, I just wanted to know, is there anything that you wanted to add to what Alistair said just now in terms of key trends, South Africa's appetite and capacity for funding these projects?
Sure, thanks, Vikas, and hello to everybody who's listening in. Actually, to be honest, I think Alistair hit the nail on the head on most of those points, to be fair. I think some of his analysis I completely agree with. I mean, parking the BEE side, if you look at round 5, there wasn't one party as a lead sponsor who won a deal there that hadn't won a deal before. So what you're starting to see is a trend of the big players winning, and it'll be interesting to see in round 6, given there is more capacity available, but at the same time, the project sizes are going to be bigger. So, more or less, let's assume there's similar number of winners, give or take. It'll be interesting to see if there are any new winners in the market. And like you said, there has been consolidation amongst players, and there's likely to be more. I mean, there's examples of equity transactions that have happened at a platform level recently that I think have certainly whetted the appetites of a number of players in the local market who might be intrigued to sell their platforms, given the price at which, or the reported prices at which some of those platforms have now been recently sold. The other point I just wanted to make, which I think Alistair highlighted as well, but just to emphasize, is around the terms that banks are now providing to these projects. I think Alistair maybe have been a bit euphemistic. The market is very overheated. And I think if you look globally, some of the terms that South African banks, and I'm not pointing fingers at the other banks, I think we're just as guilty of it as others. But if you look globally, the terms at which banks are funding here, and I'm not necessarily talking solely around the margin, because the margins are super aggressive, but at the same time, there's also there's also other terms that are at play. I think you need to take into account that globally, those are very competitive. I mean, as an example, banking P75 Wind as a senior debt provider is, I wouldn't say globally unheard of, but is very, very much an exception if you look at standards in international markets. So it just gives you a sense of how heated the market is. And I think Alistair's point is also well made, is I agree with him. I think there are going to be projects that are going to default. And to be honest, perhaps that's, it's sad to say, and I sincerely hope it's none of the projects we're involved in, to be honest, speaking expediently, but I think that maybe that's what the market needs, to almost a little bit, to correct a little bit. And the problem we've had is that there've been lots of deals that have signed, closed, but haven't yet necessarily gone through the construction phase and into operations, when you can actually see when, how those problems manifest and what the results and consequences are of those very tight terms that Alistair mentioned. The other point I just wanted to make was just around the funding, and I'm in a similar boat to what Al has said around the local markets funding capacity and capability. And I think if you do a practical bottoms-up calculation of the amount of funding that's required, it becomes staggering. And then I think, yes, when you compare it on a theoretical basis to what the local market can fund, I do think that it's insufficient. However, if you look at the past, generally these things take longer to roll out than what we expect for various reasons. And generally the market then develops. Assets are sold to new players who come in who maybe don't like the construction risk but want the operational risk, and that then frees up balance sheet capacity for those parties that do like the construction risk. And I think, as Alistair mentioned, the market has evolved. It's become more developed, and that's a good thing. So you're crowding in more and more investors into the sector, predominantly local, but also international, who some of whom can take the rand risk. So my view is that, yes, on a theoretical level, it's a monstrous amount, and it looks, that the South African market can't absorb that. But practically, I think they will, as changes like Regulation 28 come into being, and more institutional and other investors are crowded into the sector.
Okay, great. That's actually a very helpful note for those of us that are not as privy to the banking sector's thinking. I mean, that's useful to know that there is that appetite. And a question that I have, and that's come up quite a few times, is I think a lot of this, the banking or the general financial sector's willingness to engage with the program has been premised on government providing their sovereign guarantee that backstops Eskom's obligations. But as I'm sure you know, the fiscal space for continuing that, and especially again looking at the scale of the investment needed, is closing, and I'm pretty sure that National Treasury would like not to have to provide that anymore. What is your sense of the ability of the market to continue, closing deals without a sovereign guarantee, and are there alternative mechanisms, credit enhancement, security mechanisms that you would consider, that you'd like to see in this space?
So the answer is yes. I think there are alternatives that can be considered, and to be fair, Bernard and his team have engaged willingly and proactively with the market on thinking around how we can solve this problem, because as you say, it's not a never-ending guarantees that can be provided. I think the trap that people sometimes fall into is to see it as black and white. So you either have a sovereign guarantee or you don't. There's actually a whole continuum of options on that spectrum that you can consider, and we're seeing some of them play out interestingly in the C&I space, where there are termination regimes, and I'm not able to give the details, but which don't translate to a full guarantee of the debt and equity in the event of buyer default. So there are ways to unlock that mechanism, but there then are changes that need to be made to how the plant is able to pivot should Eskom fail to pay. And that might be, can you then sell to other users? What are your options? Because as this market develops, particularly in this embedded generation and general C&I space, we're seeing it move towards more of a merchant market. I don't want to say it is a merchant market yet, because I think that we're some way away from that. But certainly the thinking around, who else can you sell to should your primary off-taker be unwilling or unable to pay? So I think there are developments in the market that can assist in the removal or reduction of those sovereign guarantees. The other thing just to think about is it's a little bit more complex again than looking at it on a black and white basis. There's general ongoing payments from Eskom, which are really the lifeblood to the project. I mean, people need to also appreciate these are limited recourse financings. Nobody is obligated to put any more money in, should the project not be able to meet its OPEX and debt requirements. So, that ongoing payment is, or delay in those ongoing payments is actually strangling the project completely. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, of course, is if there's a fundamental default and you actually need to terminate the PPA because of buyer default, how does equity and debt get their money back? And that's where you're starting to see some of these innovative structures around in the C&I space. So the answer to your question is I do think there are alternatives within the kind of within the Eskom government wheelhouse. Apart from that, you also get into credit enhancement mechanisms with multilateral guarantee providers or international funders, which we've seen in West African markets and East African markets, and we've certainly closed our own fair share of deals with those sorts of structures. And that might be an additional alternative which Eskom and National Treasury may want to consider. And certainly from a bank's perspective would be more than adequate. Obviously the devil's in the detail, and it may in some ways also crowd in international funders, because they may be able to take more of a view with that sort of backstop than just with National Treasury, bearing in mind though you still have the rand aspect, which isn't attractive to all international funders because they either can't fund long-term rands or don't want the long-term rand return.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, I'll get back to you with some questions. I see there's a few from the Q&A that I can address to you, but before I do that, I just wanted to get back to Bernard quickly. Bernard, we recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I saw a quiet announcement on the fact that the small IPP projects that had been awarded, I think around 2014-15, the 20 projects, I think each 5 megawatts meant to increase South African participation, that those had been cancelled. Could you just explain why that is, especially given the fact that we need power desperately?
Yeah, because I think that program, from where we see it as the IPP office and the DMRE, it's concluded. So the process is concluded. We have communicated to the preferred bidders. We have even issued a statement on the 21st of July to explain exactly, why we ended up where we were. So I think, I mean, it was the real reason was that we didn't have a buyer for the program. The buyer, did not approve the PPA, signing the PPA, and as a result, without the buyer, you cannot continue with the program. And that was clearly indicated in our communication on the 21st of July. So from where we sit, the program is concluded.
Okay, so and just to be clear, the buyer is Eskom in this case,
yeah,
and
yeah.
they refused to sign the PPAs.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We look forward to engaging on that a bit more. What is the other question I had? And I mean, there's quite a few questions that's coming through as well on the the fact that South Africa's investment landscape is changing quite rapidly. There's a decentralization happening. There's bid programs being run from commercial and industrial clients, municipalities. So what do you think is the role of a centralized procurement program like we have right now within this kind of changing investment landscape? And do you see the IPP office or the REAP type program potentially playing a role in kind of coordinating all these different programs or stakeholders in a way to minimize transaction costs and improve efficiencies and scale, economies of scale?
Yeah, I think where we are now, there's a lot happening. I agree with you. But at the same time, we know that there is a lot more capacity that's required. So in the short term, and short term mean at least up to the next 5 years, there will be a need for a central procurement role, whether that's in this current form or it matures into a different entity or merge with transmission. I think some people have made those suggestions. That obviously will depend on what happens with the bundling with Eskom, what happens with the ERA amendment. But what we know we need in this country is a lot of energy. And there will be, even with the CNI space, there will be residual demand that needs to be catered for. And I think you mentioned 60 gigawatts. I don't think there is any one procurement process, whether it's CNI or ourselves, that can pull out that amount of procurement in the next 10 years. So we will need all the collaborations from Eskom building its own capacity to CNI space, municipalities, to the program like REAP continuing as well. And I think what I personally see happening in future, there will be a need to start looking at grid stability related projects. You know, whether it's a separate procurement purely on storage or those kind of technologies, just to make sure that the grid operator is still able to manage the grid. Because right now, you know, the CNI space, the municipalities, everyone is procuring, but that central coordination at some point, and I'm hoping the next IRP will probably address this. Okay.
Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a important and key role to be played by the centralized procurement process, and I think it's really important that is maintained. And so we're very happy to see these new announcements about new bid windows and hopefully also financial closure for these outstanding projects. Just a question that's also come through on the Q&A is around local content. There has been some changes to the local content requirements in the last windows, and the question specifically relates to how that impacts the ability of projects to reach financial close or commercial close. But I would also like to just more broadly understand the current thinking around local content requirements and how that is likely to kind of continue in the program.
Yes, I think when the DTIC made the decision to reduce the local content requirement for Window 5 and risk mitigation, they've also indicated that we will continue to monitor the space. So if capacity is a challenge going forward, we'll have to respond accordingly. But obviously, our main drive is to try and get as much local content as possible, so that we can build this economy. My view is, it will be a missed opportunity for South Africa if we don't maximize the benefit from this procurement that will be running. You keep mentioning 60 gigawatts, so I'll use that. I mean, to procure 60 gigawatts from imported products or components, I think it will be a missed opportunity for South Africa. I think we need to maximize what we can get out of it, and perhaps even create exports industries from this opportunity. So we will continue to require local content in our programs.
Okay. Then just a question on the kind of mode of procurement. So so obviously the REAP process is very strictly time bound. There's lots of competition. We've heard about the kind of smallish pool of bidders that are winning. There are obviously other procurement methods, right? There's, for example, feed-in tariffs, which for those, for example, following the story in Vietnam, was successful in securing, I think, 9 gigawatts in a year. Is there, I mean, and you can, I don't know whether this is something that is within your mandate, but would that be something that you would consider rolling out to address, you know, both issues around the pace of investment as well as possibly issues around market concentration or more local capacity or local participation?
Look, I think what I can confirm is that, you know, the programs like what you referred to, what happened in Vietnam, and the refit programs and incentivizing residential or commercial customers to. I think the IPP office has enough in its plate. I don't think we will participate in that. We were involved in the discussions around this, you know, addressing the energy crisis through the presidency, and those suggestions were put forward, and I think the relevant departments and ESCOM are working on that. But certainly we are not going to participate on that. But in terms of our program, we will continue to refine our program to respond to what the grid requires, and to try and speed up, because I think that's the one issue that we are all concerned about. It shouldn't take 2 years to roll out a procurement program to reach the financial close. We have to find ways to reduce that timelines, and we have started engaging. I think you will see that with bid window 6, we are going to put a lot more pressure on the preferred bidders and the lenders and everybody and ESCOM to issue the BQs timeously, so that we can close those projects much sooner than what has happened in the past. So that's the one area where we are focusing, looking at you know, where can we optimize the time to procure. And the presidency process is also assisting in making sure that all the other government authorizations and consents can be refined further. We have been given assurance that, you know, it will take maximum 57 days for some of these approvals that used to take 300 days. So that's the step in the right direction. The one area where we still have to find ways to reduce the time is the generation license. NERSA's timelines are highly prescribed in law, but we have been engaging to see how best we can. And if we can sort out that one, I think we would have made enough strides, because I think NERSA requires 120 days, if I'm not mistaken. So even if we can get 30 days out of that, I think it will make a huge difference in reducing the procurement timelines.
Okay, thank you. That's very good to know. The issue that was mentioned earlier around pricing, and I think the mismatch between what is bid and what is then coming from EPC contractors. I think in the initial rounds of REAP, bidders had to have some level of agreement from EPC contractors on pricing as well. And I just wanted to check, is that something that would be considered for new rounds as well, to try and deal with this uncertainty around cost escalations?
Yes, we are looking at all options. There's been a number of suggestions that we put forward by the market, especially in light of what's happening with risk mitigation and bid window 5. And that's one of the suggestions, you know, to force the bidders to also, you know, have made some commitments up front before submitting the bids. There's been suggestions around using some of the indexes, and rather than, you know, just limiting the adjustments to Forex and interest rates. Maybe look at, you know, some of the components, if there are indices that are available globally, whether we can consider those. Yeah, and there's been a lot of suggestions that we have to really consider in light of the fact that, we are procuring for government, and government procurement is very, very regulated and complex. But we are considering all these options. In future bid windows, yes, there might be some new proposals that we want the market to look at as a way of managing this risk.
Okay, but we
are also concerned. We are also concerned. We want to close. We need the capacity like yesterday.
Okay, but we will have to wait for you to make those public before we have a clear sense of what those might be.
Yes, and I mean we also, if there are any other suggestions from the academic world, please feel free to share with us, so
sure.
that as we consider, we also take all possibilities and options into account.
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Bernard. I'm gonna give you a chance to get out of the hot seat quickly. Mfundi, I just wanted to come back to you quickly because there's been a few questions in the Q&A around grid access and the budget quote CL process. Maybe if you could just explain, I think for everyone, the process more or less that you go through. So when a potential bidder or even a private project comes to you, what is it that you look at? When does the CL get issued? What happens in between that and the budget quote? What is needed for you to actually provide that final document? And where are the kind of the bottlenecks in the process? Sorry, Mfundi, I think you are muted at the moment.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Thank you, Vikas. There are two processes that I'm going to explain. The first one is the cost estimate letter. And in both processes, I would like to take the audience through the historic understanding of what it meant to apply for a mine, for example, in the Rustenburg area, or for a small development estate in the Western Cape, where there is the wine farm, versus what we are facing now, so that we have a proper understanding of what it means. Previously, what we had in the power system, I cannot explain this without linking it to the power system. So that is one emphasis that I would like the audience to be clear about, that it is about capacity and it is about the power system before anything else. Previously, what we had over the past 10 or so years before we had the crisis, the energy crisis, there were available capacity in terms of the feeder base where you connect. There was available capacity in terms of the transformation. There was available capacity in terms of the lines. Even if we went into redundancy, those parameters were still met according to the grid code, no issues. Now, with the uptake of the IPPs and with the depletion of baseload coal generation in the Mpumalanga area and the other issues, what has happened now is that the uptake of the IPPs has gone into where the renewable energy resources are. In the initial windows, all that capacity that was there was exhausted, which means that it was almost wiped out in a shorter time than was anticipated. But however, the transmission development plan had been developed to absorb load as and when load comes in. And those plans now are superseded by this rate at which generation is connecting and exhausting that capacity. Though we have not had the load growth from the normal load, for example, a new mine coming online. But from the IPP's perspective, those spaces where there was enough capacity has now been taken by the IPPs. Now, when a CL is being applied for, we get a letter. The CL has been paid. We have all the stakeholders. We call it a SHIM, which means all stakeholders. We inform the distribution, the transmission, planners, the engineers that this is what we have now. So because most of the connections are at the grid access unit and the connections are at 132 kV and up, they start there. The planner now has to do a power system analysis to check whether it's the 100 megawatt that is requested at, say, grassroots substation. Do we have capacity at that point? Then it looks at the upstream network, not only that particular point. Having looked at the upstream network, what will impact, what will be the overall impact of the system, not that particular point? Now, the analysis of that should be technically viable, such that it can be questioned and it does not result in the system now being constrained, or if it results in other portions of the network being relieved, then that's it. That process on its own has to have a report that is a record of showing that an analysis was done. After that, we go through the second leg, which is you have this proposal as distribution. If you discover that, for example, grassroots might not be able to handle that, then you touch base with the transmission colleague, which the voltages which are above 132, whether there's 275, 220, 400, 765 kV or 533 kV DC in the case of Apollo Soko, then that analysis now gets into a bigger analysis of the network, which involves corridors, which are bigger. Now, the analysis of the corridors cannot be done without considering the fact that there might be reversal of power flows. There might be overloading of other substations. The same detail that was done at the distribution level has to check on the intermeshing, on the interconnected network below the point of connection. Now, all those processes are done by engineers that have got several applications. For example, per week, I have been signing an average per day of between, on a good day, I might sign maybe, where I say I'm not busy, maybe 5 CELs. Now, this particular planners and engineers, one engineer could be having per week 10 to 15 that he has to analyze. Then while doing that analysis, we have to ensure that it is cross-checked against the plans that are existing. In distribution, we've got what we call network development plans, master plans, to how do they align with the transmission development plans. Now that process, that is why now, that process might take whether it's a month or so, or more than that, depending on how complex the network is. Now, after the scope has been defined to say, the cost estimate letter says you have to add 1, 2, 3. It has to be now put into the costing tool to check whether we've got standard, we know the costs so far here and there, then they are vetted, they are checked. It goes back through that process, and there it goes out, and then it has now to be issued out, and then I signed it out, and then it goes out. And that process was taking about 90 days. Now we have cut that process. We are endeavoring to work close to 50 plus days or less, depending on the complexity of the system. Now, if, as an example, we have a customer that wants to connect, say, 1 gigawatts or 500 megawatts, that is equivalent to having a 1 unit out of Medupi or 1 unit out of any other big power station. Now, we cannot do just what we call steady state flows now. We have to consider the transient stability. We have to consider a much bigger picture and scan and say, how will it change overall? It might even result in a new corridor. So that might go beyond the 90 days of the CEL. And that will involve different legs of studies. You know, the transition development plan that you have right now. Once you put 1 gigawatt, it might result in a completely new corridor. That might now have to tell you that you have to do an EIA, you have to have a loop in, loop out, or you might have to reconfigure the network. And as prudent engineers and as professionals, we have to work with options. And while working on that, mind you, we are not focusing on only this 1 gigawatt or 100 megawatts. There are several others that are coming in. Hence, we have developed what we call the queuing rules to ensure that as we plan and deal with this work, we are referring to a reference point and we check across what has come into the network, what is now out, what has been constructed, and what is projected to be constructed at the dates that are coming in. And that is how the cost estimate letter is developed. Thank you.
Just a quick question to follow up on that. There's been, I mean, considering how much work is involved in this, do you have, as a grid access unit, do you have enough people working there, and do you have the kind of all the software, all the support that you need to do this?
In terms of grid access unit, is the coordinating element. The engineers that do the analysis are in the respective provinces, in the clusters. For example, we've got the Cape Coastal Cluster, which involves the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. We've got the Gamma, which involves the Northwest and the Northern Cape. Then we've got the East Coastal, Central East, which is KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State. We have got the Limlanga, which is Mpumalanga and Limpopo. So, in these provinces, we have seasoned engineers, planners that have got the capacity to handle this. But however, with the large volumes of the IPPs that are coming in, we are in the process. We are in the process of upskilling some other people, and engineers are joining in that fraternity. So, from a planning perspective, at transmission level, we have the grid planning department, which focuses on planning strictly, which looks at the transmission system. Now, in terms of capacitating that, or currently what we have is that we are adding more capacity, and we are ensuring that the right people are doing the right job and they know what they're talking about. And now, in addition to that, what we have done is we have cut the number of steps that were required. For example, previously, we would have had maybe 3 or 4 steps. We've cut them to about 2 or 3. Previously, we would have had maybe 3 or so, maybe a certain committee. We have found ways to ensure that there is a quicker turnaround time. So on the skills level, we are upskilling and we are getting more skills. And from a grid access unit perspective, we have restructured ourselves to ensure that one part of the country, one region, does not find itself now overwhelmed. For example, the Northern Cape and the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. Those 3 have had the lion's share of applications, which aligns with what the previous speaker was speaking about, to say there are 13 or so. Everyone has been going there. So we have restructured grid access units to be ready for that. Now, however, there is another element which might not be an element of skill. It will be an element of the tools. The issue of the number of applications that we are getting. Initially, it was the less than 100 megawatts. Now it's non-DMRE, and it's almost like the floodgates have opened. We are developing an automated process to ensure that as CELs come, all the elements that come in can work with that. And this is aligned to what we call the queuing rules that we have workshopped with the industry. We are further workshopping with the industry to ensure that what we have talks to the industry, the technology assists us in addition to the human skill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mfundi. There's a lot of discussion still in the Q&A around some of these grid issues. If you have a moment, you can maybe type a response where needed. But I think we've got about 8 minutes left, and I just wanted to Bernard, there were two specific questions from Terence Creamer from Engineering News that I hope you could respond to. So the first question that Terence asks is, can you confirm that any extension beyond the October deadline will be made only in instances where the IPP office capacity has caused a delay and not where a bidder may have outstanding project or environmental issues?
Thanks for that question, Terence. Yeah, obviously we will have to look at all the surrounding circumstances in making such a decision. I can confirm that the 30th of October deadline is fixed, subject to the capacity in the IPP office. If there are any other issues that the bidders raise, it will have to look at those as well. But as far as I understand, all the other bidder-related issues have been resolved, and if it's not resolved, then it's the risk of the bidder, not something that we carry on our side. But just keep in mind as well, there are project-specific issues over and above what I raised, which may be on our side, which we must also take into account.
Okay.
So I don't want to discuss the bidder-specific issues, but there are more issues than just the capacity of the IPP office that we will still have to consider.
Okay. And then, so his second question was specifically around the battery storage RFP. Can you provide any more detail on the size, some of the bid architecture, bid submission deadline, any of those kinds of broad parameters?
Terence, unfortunately, I'm not at liberty right now. Otherwise, I will be crucified. We still have to get all the official, decisions that were signed off. Some of them last night, some of them this morning. So I think let's wait for next week. We should be in a better position to confirm exactly what went into the market.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard. Then I'm gonna ask Rogan there's a question around local content requirements for private IPP projects. Rogan has volunteered to answer that. So maybe you can quickly respond there. Rogan?
Hi, Vikas, I am here.
Okay, good.
I'm able to switch on my. I'm unable to switch on my video for some reason. But yeah, I mean, local content, obviously there's different details for the different technologies. So from a PV perspective or solar PV project, there are certain requirements that you have to meet in terms of local modules. On our projects, we are focused on the wind side of things. So from that perspective, the requirements are that we are to source 40% of total content from local sources. So that obviously is an extremely challenging target if you consider the fact that the hiatus of REAP really was detrimental to the continued establishment of those specific sectors. The way that the IPPs have the ability to meet those various thresholds are dependent on the type of technology. So as I mentioned, for PV, the largest component in a PV farm is probably the structures or the mounting structures, and then the solar panels themselves. We're quite limited in South African produced panels, unfortunately. And then on the wind side of things, unfortunately, there aren't any South African turbine suppliers. Otherwise, we'd probably know about them by now. But the towers we are able to construct out of concrete. So local concrete towers are set up to achieve and meet those local content requirements. A change in bid window 5 was the inclusion of designated local content, where the DTIC designates specifically a sector that they're looking to develop. And so there are specific requirements to achieving or meeting those targets as far as designated local content are concerned.
Okay, and another question that was posed on the group, sorry, on the Q&A was regarding the skills that you mentioned, the resource vacuum. Could you provide a bit more detail on what exactly those skills are that you're seeing not in the market at the moment that you need, or that the broader industry needs to be able to roll out successfully?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think across the board, a general lack of available resources. It's not maybe necessarily the skills. The skills are here in the market, but it's the number of resources available with those skills. And it is across the board. I think if you look at the value chain of renewable energy projects, it starts at the project development. So people with experience and the adequate skills and knowledge on how to develop a project site, which is quite time intensive. You know, you need to negotiate with landowners, and actually before that, you need to identify, you know, sites that have good access to the grid. So you need to understand the grid. You have to know how to develop a project site. Once your project site is permitted and established to a certain degree, it gets handed over to kind of the commercial teams in IPPs. That's kind of where I fit in, the business developers who commercialize that project opportunity. So you're either looking at putting it into a bid type structure like the REAP program, or on a private project or private off-taker deal, slightly different, where there might not be that competitive bidding process. You know, in that commercialization step, there are a plethora of different departments and skills required. You've got your design engineers, the general engineering and development, you've got grid specialists, you've got the finance teams, both on the corporate and the project finance side, who liaise with the banks, the lawyers. I mean, from a legal standpoint, the requirements are significant as you're looking at all these agreements. So generally across the board, and I think there was also a question around the future of these competitive bidding type rounds. And I think, you know, clearly given recent relaxations in licensing caps and the moves that the government has made to liberalize generation and the ability for embedded generation projects to come online, I think you're seeing the prevalence of some bilateral agreements between large off-takers and IPPs. So clearly that also consumes a number of the resources available to the broader market. So I think it's across the board, and it's a factor of how quickly, first of all, the small base that our country has come off, and then the hiatus, and then the sudden uptake in interest across the sectors. So from residential through commercial, industrial, into utility scale. And I think the leveling up of the commercial and industrial with utility, you know, we're now seeing projects from a private perspective upwards of 100 megawatts each, which is the same kind of scale that we're looking at in these REAP type procurement rounds.
Thank you, Rogan. I am very conscious of the time. I know some of the panelists need to leave for other meetings now. As you heard, there's a battery storage RFP that goes out today. There's also a deadline for bid window 6, I think, on Monday. So thank you for everyone that's participated. Before we end off, I just wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to make any final comments regarding the REAP program, the sector in general, where you see it going, what your hope is, and what we need to do to together address the energy crisis. Bernard, do you have a parting nugget of wisdom for us?
Yeah, we're waiting for Monday. We're looking forward to receiving those bids on Monday. There was a question on the panel about the doubling up of bid window 6. We couldn't get to bid to 5,000. What was it? Sorry, we couldn't get to 5,200 megawatts because we didn't have the PV capacity available in the existing determination, and we are going to procure 4,200, and we are looking at ways to see how we can cover the remaining 1,000 megawatts. But otherwise, yeah, that's what we are running towards as the IPP office. We're preparing to receive bids on Monday. So hopefully we'll meet some of the audiences at the IPP office on Monday.
Thank you, and good luck with that. Daniel, I know you actually have a meeting, I think that's starting already as well. Do you have anything final that you wanted to add?
The only point I just wanted to add, which I should have mentioned earlier, is I think just given the booming CNI market, I think what we are going to start seeing is I think there are going to be players who've been successful in REAP, who I think are going to perhaps start saying, well, is REAP necessarily where I want to deploy my resources and bid into the REAP specifically? It's super competitive. You have to be at the rivet. Everything is pushed to the nth degree, and that's just a function of how successful the program's been and the auction process that's been run. But I do think that there might be a few parties that start to think, well, maybe let me rather bid into a CNI program, RFP, where it's perhaps a little bit less competitive. The returns are maybe a little bit higher, and there's a little bit more fat in the system to play with. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that. I think that they're horses for courses. Already you can see niche IPPs who play in that smaller scale program and RFP. So I think that that's positive developments in the market. But I think that that's something that we need to just keep in the back of our minds on how this market develops. I think there'll be more opportunities and more options, and so there'll be horses for different courses. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think at this stage it's an all of the above moment. I think we need as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Alistair?
I'm not sure there's much to add other than to say that I think we all know that the procurement of new power is long overdue. It's very welcomed by everybody. Certainly, I think everybody at living at home without generators is looking forward to the days when load shedding is over. So the sooner we can procure more power, the better.
Thank you, Alistair. Mfundi, thanks for your time as well. Any final parting words from your side? Sorry, you're muted again.
Sorry about the muting. My final parting words would be, it has been a good discussion and we welcome the comments. However, looking forward for bid window 6 and the other windows, we are expecting a big turnaround time in terms of the CLs as you have seen them. But when it comes to the designs, we are encouraging the IPPs to work with us and to appoint consultants as soon as they are making their intentions to go ahead, so that in terms of their designs, particularly the designs, let's work with the designs earlier and understand what is it that you are designing, because you are designing from a family of the infrastructure that is in the ESCOM standards and set of equipment that we can work with, so that we don't have to go back and forth. And in so doing, let's also align with what is in the transition development plan, so that you piggyback on what is already there, so that we don't have to be starting from scratch, and ensure that so that we can all, as we must approach this as SA Inc., not as IPPs or ESCOM. And we are all together in this, and together we will have our lights back on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mfundi. And then lastly, Rogan, you have the opportunity to send us out with the parting words from, I guess, the only bid window 5 successful closer at the moment. What can you say to the rest of the bidders that need to compete with you in bid window 6?
No, thanks, Vikas, and thanks everyone for my fellow panelists for the constructive discussion. I think I think we all, it shows quite a similar view and understanding of the scenario that we all face ourselves in. And I think it's not that common where we sit on a panel and we discuss as independent market experts or industry experts in an industry that so rawly affects the vast population. So we, I think, are intricately aware, both as citizens suffering through load shedding that the rest of the country suffers through, to just understand that there isn't a silver bullet for load shedding. This isn't an issue that has come about now and is easily fixed by the removal of a CEO, for instance. This is an issue that is 10, 15, 20 years in the making, and that we really need to stand together and solve the issue, as SA Inc., as Mfundi said. So really, there is no silver bullet. I think it's going to be a solution that comes from SA Inc. at large. It's not going to be just Eskom's solution. It's not just the IPPs or the IPP office. But really looking forward to the next couple of years. I think from an energy industry perspective, I think we should strap ourselves in. I think we'll see some liberalization in the energy market, and looking forward to the follow-up discussion in a couple of months' time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you from my side as well to all the panelists. We really appreciate all the time you put in, and we are, I think as has been said a few times, we're all committed to solving this crisis and working together. And so it's great to have all of you here and seeing how that's being done. And yeah, we're looking forward to speaking to you again. Have a good week and weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you to our audience that are still here. We won't close off abruptly. Just have a look at the last post that I put in with some website links to Power Future Labs, as well as the short course being offered. Other than that, be safe and thank you very much.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, sorry, I just on that, I've shared a slide as well that has the sign-up link for our short course that is running in October on power market reform and regulation. So if you want any more information, just please follow the link in the slide.